and today I'm filling in for another good speaker who was last minute delayed. So I'm going to present on Windows workflow development. Not so much the nuts and bolts of what you're going to be doing in Visual Studio, but what's possible and what the new tools are and what the difference is between the new platform that comes with SharePoint 2013 when you build a workflow farm and what we had previously. Let's see, I guess I have to count that. So one thing that happens in an organization is that, business processes demand answers. And so you as a SharePoint specialist might get asked, how am I going to meet these needs? So before you start down the path of advocating for workflow as a solution, you have to ask yourself, how does this match with our business users' needs? Someone has to be an intermediary to determine whether workflow is the best solution for you. So you can ask, or your BA can ask, what's getting done in a haphazard way, what's not getting done at all, what could be improved if you were able to initiate a task timeline and track progress towards a goal. Another thing that many organizations have to consider is that they have very strict regulatory requirements. So in order to meet those requirements as far as tracking and making sure that specific processes are completed in a well-defined, repeatable way, workflow is a valuable tool. So I picked out of my hat something that I've had to do a lot of, and a use scenario of IT project management. How could workflow benefit you if that was something you were tasked with? So if you're in a fast-growing company, you're going to have a lot of special projects that are happening in concert with the expansion. So streamlining is going to be a hot topic wherever you are. If you have workflow installed, you can create up workflow templates specifically for projects. And then when projects start to blossom and grow in different directions, you can simply expand that base template with custom actions in order to deal with new scenarios that weren't covered by your original template. Let's say also that your team has drafted a checklist. You want to avoid roadblocks, last-minute emergencies that are going to stop that project in its tracks. So you can build in status checks, approvals. Your timeline can be monitored by your workflow. So let's say in this IT project you need additional servers. You have to request them. There has to be lead time. The workflow can have branches that handle the requisitions, make sure that the right equipment is there in time. It's a good way to gather a large group of people who don't see each other every day and have them all actively participating in the same project. So another thing you might have in a project like that, you might have to have certificates. You might have other tracking systems where all of your IT inventory is kept. Workflow, particularly Workflow for SharePoint 2013, can handle that. It can assign a task to assure that someone goes and purchases those certificates you need, and then it can assign another task to the IT administrator who's going to actually install them in your network. So the good thing about SharePoint 2013 workflow that is so different from SharePoint 2010 is that it integrates with your existing line of business systems. So you will be able to enter tracking data in any system that can communicate via common protocols. So I pulled this part from another presentation on how to build a workflow farm because I think it's important in most organizations that you identify the costs and benefits of what you're setting out to do. So what are the costs associated with building a workflow farm? And I know I'm risking making this audience look, just like that one, but workflow farms consist of either 1 or 3 dedicated Windows servers. They build a quorum and a SQL server. But in comparison to building a SharePoint farm, the hardware requirements are very modest. So running workflow in its own Windows workflow farm, it's no longer competing for resources in the SharePoint ecosystem. If you have a farm that's in a growth phase and it's kind of on the edge, then that's an important consideration to know that this is being taken care of elsewhere. Yes?
Question. So the SQL server, can we just build it into the SharePoint server that's already just a different workflow database, or do we need a separate server?
It's not recommended to co-locate with the SharePoint databases. Even though the requirements are modest, you don't want them under the same system. So aside from the Windows Server and SQL Server licenses, all of the software that you need to build this workflow farm is free. And the primary costs lie in licensing of the servers. You'll have at least 4 Windows Server licenses if you do a 3-server farm. And you have to spend for labor to configure the farm and its connection to SharePoint because it relies on a server-to-server trust. And also, if you choose to use certificates from an external CA, which could be very important if any part of your intranet is exposed to the web and if your employees are going to be outside the firewall and accessing from there to run workflow, then you're going to want to use, a secure connection and regular CA certificates instead of self-generated ones. But if everything lives entirely within your organization, then you're probably fine with the more modest option. So now you want to wake your audience up and you're going to tell them what are the benefits to having Windows Workflow installed. So building a Windows Workflow farm is one of the biggest bang for the buck investments that you can do as a SharePoint administrator. So one thing about 2013 Workflow is that it's highly scalable. You could build one of these workflow farms and it would probably keep you going for your first 10,000 users at least. But you can build multiple workflow farms and they easily attach to various web applications by means of a scope. So you can say this workflow farm serves this scope and in that way you can serve a geographic region or a department that might have heavier needs than the rest of your users. So it easily incorporates external data sources. We're going to discuss how it does that. It's a simple workflow farm infrastructure. There's very little maintenance once you have it set up. It's just a matter of keeping your Windows servers patched and the normal things that you would do in that matter, but frankly, you can ignore it for long periods of time and it usually stays pretty stable. So the design tools for creating workflows in a Windows workflow farm have been completely transformed. They're much better, much more open to modern development standards. Having a workflow farm, it aids compliance because it maintains a trackable list of workflow actions. And because these are in the workflow farm, a record of those messages, then they aren't covered by the same backup that your SharePoint system is and won't be lost in quite the same way. So you've got workflow, what now? That's my favorite workflow. Because it does, doesn't it? Yeah. So then you get the designers involved, and this is when the new tools become important, when you're trying to integrate what people need with what you can accomplish. So what can you accomplish with workflow? Well, you can manage all the common tasks within SharePoint. You can go into a library, grant permissions, check in, check out documents, perform content approval. You can move items to a different list. You can set field values on a list. You can connect to virtually any data source that is exposed using modern web methods. And you're also able to take advantage of intrinsic features of SharePoint, such as the secure store service, if you want to obscure a login, say, to a database. You can initiate an action on the basis of a field change. For instance, someone checks in a document and forward it to an approver. You can manipulate strings. You can change file names and descriptions. And even more, you can create a project from a list item and then take actions based on project events. So these kinds of triggers are very valuable because when we're relying on people to take steps manually, everyone has a heavy workload and steps can be missed. But when they're locked within a workflow, you're basically cattle shooting your users into performing the activities in the manner that you wish them done. So you can set status or value fields within the project if that project is checked in. You can also, this is the powerful portion that comes with the SharePoint 2013 model, you can connect to external systems via REST or OData. And so you really don't have very many limits as to what you can accomplish with workflow. Anything that you can't manipulate with workflow directly, you can either pre-process or post-process in an external system to get it ready to be used. So when we talk about the functions and features unique to SharePoint 2013 workflow, they're provided by a Windows Workflow farm, which is connected to the SharePoint farm by a server-to-server trust. And the workflow farm utilizes a messaging service. And this is just much like, if my husband and I, we had a child at soccer, And one of us texted and said, you know, child needs to be picked up from the field at 3 o'clock. And so that message goes out, the task is assigned, then someone goes to the field and says, I've got the child, you don't need to worry, and so the task is complete, right? So in the same way, that is what the service bus for the Windows Workflow Farm does. It sends the task out there in a messaging queue. When that one is accomplished, then you're able to move forward to the next task. And it also creates a trackable record. The other good thing is that once you have designed and built a workflow, that workflow is a template for every instance after that. So you no longer have to manage a task manually. So again, as we talked about, SharePoint 2013 workflow integrates with external data sources. So you can still use external content types, but you're not locked down to them anymore. And this is a big change that's very welcome in terms of both supportability and security. Whoops. So there are new features that allow a user to create what was possible previously only through custom development. And developers can do things that were not possible for them either. They can reach out to unrelated systems in any programming languages they wish, and then they can pull the resulting data back into SharePoint. It doesn't matter what your line of business system is. As long as you can set up a service that exposes its data, then SharePoint can consume it. So the steps available to out-of-the-box workflows in SharePoint Designer have also improved a lot. If you've worked to create SharePoint workflows before, you'll see that previously there was a straight linear course that you had to follow. If you needed something that stepped out of that course, you pretty much had to go to Visual Studio and develop a state-based workflow. But no longer is that the case because there is a new function called loops. And this is a graphic I found regarding loops that I liked a lot. And it kind of represents a couple of things that are typical of loops in the new SharePoint Designer, and that is that there is one entry point and one exit point to a loop. So you go into the loop and you cannot go out until the condition is met. So you can contain a number of steps inside of a workflow, but you cannot contain workflow stages. Loops live within stages. And to look at a practical example of what you could use this for, perhaps you're collecting survey data. And you say, well, I want the loop to run indefinitely until every single person has responded. I'm just going to nag my users to death until I get my 100% response to my survey. Or you could be kind and you could say, okay, I'll make 3 requests. And then if in 3 requests I haven't gotten whatever number of responses I've gotten after 3 requests, I'll exit out of this loop and back to the main workflow. So another really great thing is, and this is a big change, there has been some connection between Visio and SharePoint Designer before, but now they have turned Visio Enterprise 2013 into a full-blown workflow design tool. So you have a new design service, and the file types are compatible between both SharePoint Designer 2013 and Visio. And so the Visio diagram is able to display directly within SharePoint Designer. And then if the workflow project grows to the point where you feel like it's very complex and you need to do more custom coding, you can export from there to Visual Studio. So they share a file type, not necessary to perform any type of import or export to take advantage of Visio to design in SharePoint 2013 workflows. And you don't have to use both programs if you want. You can use one or the other. You can take advantage of Visio features from within SharePoint Designer. If you have them both installed, you can use this Visio workspace without leaving SharePoint Designer as your design program. So this is a very interesting portion of it. When you create a workflow diagram on the design service, you can choose from all the typical workflow actions that we saw in the previous graphic, and flowchart style visuals will become actual programmatic steps in your workflow. Go ahead.
This portion you're talking about right here, the interaction with Designer and Visio, is that only for the 2013 workflow?
That's correct.
Or
yeah.
not the 2010 workflow?
No, and this presentation is primarily focused on the advantages of 2013 because it's a huge change. Instead of workflow being something that we call legacy 2010 workflows that were a part of SharePoint, this is a whole separate area. So that SharePoint's taking advantage of. So when you have these programmatic steps, it's like any auto-generated code. It might not be exactly the way you'd write it, but go ahead.
This will carry through to 2016.
That is my understanding, yeah. And also Office 365. So, I could have made that more clear. But that's limited to the client side. When you're coding to Office 365, this is what they have for workflow. They have built a workflow farm on the back end that you would utilize. So all of these same tools would work for Office 365. And now with the release of SharePoint 2016, they have merged the code base between Office 365 and SharePoint 2016. And because that's the case, things that apply to Office 365 are going to apply also to SharePoint 2016 ongoing, accepting that 2016 might not get all of the features that the cloud has because that's their primary focus.
So I just came from another session where I learned that with 2016, SharePoint Designer is no longer going to be available for workflows. It's got a big red X. Will Visio 2013 Professional be an alternative? Can we use Visio Studio?
That's a question that I can't answer because this is a presentation that I gave 6 months ago. So it's a good point that you brought up, and I'll research it. And if you take my card, I'll be glad to get back with you afterwards, and we can discuss it. And then I'll be better prepared for the next time. So for me, this integration between the two, it adds to the value. And the reason that it adds to the value is because the business unit can now do prototypes. Visio is a tool they understand. And so they can go in and say, I need the workflow to do step A, step B, step C, step D. And wow, they have generated code for you from your business users. So anything that more closely integrates the business side and IT is a very valuable win. So here's another really cool thing about SharePoint 2013 workflow, and that is that you can build reusable custom actions. Now when your workflow complexity goes to the point where it exceeds what you can do in Visio and Designer, you can move over to Visual Studio and you can still enable your BAs and power users to work in Designer because a developer can create a custom action in Visual Studio. So a very complex process can be coded, installed with SharePoint Designer. The example I gave there was connecting and to performing queries on Salesforce data. And then someone can use that in the same quick fashion that they can any other action in SharePoint Designer. So when you buy a third-party tool to customize your workflow, one of the things that they'll advertise is that they have hundreds of these connectors built. And so that's basically what you buy when you buy a tool like that, is the ability to have all of these connections pre-built. So another really key advantage, and this was a basic change with the SharePoint 2013 platform, is that we now have the separate app model. And so you can, if you have apps set up in your SharePoint 2013 farm, workflows can also be set up to run under app permissions. So if it doesn't have direct access to something, it's kind of like, let's say you have a user whose boss doesn't want them to have access to a certain private library of documents, but once a month, they want that user to go ahead and upload a very key report. So a workflow is created, the user still never has access to the library, only the workflow does, but the user is able to complete the document or report, start the workflow, and as a result of that workflow, it gets uploaded to that private library. So the user has more power to accomplish needed tasks than they would have if they were trying to do it under their own identity. So when you're provisioning a workflow to use an application identity, it's assigned permissions directly. So as we mentioned, it can cross boundaries that individual users cannot, and it runs under its own identity. However, your users will need certain permissions on the list in order to activate the workflow unless it's triggered by an event. So the key foregoing word is identity, because everything within SharePoint runs upon an identity, right down to an item on a list. Everything has a GUID. So SharePoint constantly security trims to show only what that identity is allowed to see. And in order for an app to operate autonomously within SharePoint, it has to request in the app manifest when you create an app, one of 4 pre-configured permission levels. And the levels are very adequate. They range from just read to full control. And they're meant to mirror the basic levels such as read, contributor, and so on, management and full control that you would have for a user. But they weren't left open to customization, and the reason for that is that if a developer were to request certain specific permissions and they weren't granted, it might cause the app to fail. So they have locked that down to certain canned permission levels. And once installed, and it has to be installed by someone who possesses at least the level of rights requested by the app, then it can perform specific actions, and it can be anything from modifying data, emailing users. So that is the reason why app permissions is very useful when you want to allow a user to execute actions only within the context of running a workflow. So beyond expanding the rights to run typical workflow actions, operating as an app also allows a workflow to benefit from all of the client-side object model. Everything that's open to applications is open to workflow. And really, if you're creative, you can probably think of a lot of ways to connect provider-hosted applications that you may use in your environment with workflow tasks. So manipulating managed metadata. Now, for managed metadata, the permissions that are available are locked down to read, write. But creating sites or lists, user profiles, anything that's exposed in the API is also available for workflow programmers. So you have to have both the workflow and app services infrastructure fully set up in your farm. And in the other presentation I gave on configuration, there's a few little tests that you can do to make sure that SharePoint 2013 workflow is available and functioning as you expect. And when you're in Designer, the way that you utilize this is you wrap your piece of code that you want to run with this elevated permission that the app has inside of what's called an app step. So, but at this point, that is a key point where you need an experienced developer. And you need to move some of this over to Visual Studio because there is a complicated chain of events that has to happen for this to succeed. And of course, once you have this code for the app, you don't have to repeat that over and over. But, I'm just so fast with this thing. Okay, so authentication is going to require that you obtain a token from the Workflow Manager farm. There's already a server-to-server trust set up when you've installed the Workflow farm, but you'll have to pass this token to SharePoint. And then you have to also deal with SharePoint's protection against replay attacks. It has something called a digest token. And what that is it's basically like if you go to the zoo or you go to a music concert and they give you that little fluorescent stamp that expires after a while. You're only good for that day with that color. Well, for SharePoint, there's a short period of time, I think it's less than 30 minutes, and your token will expire. And so you have to continually request that and say, yes, I'm a person with a ticket, so I'm allowed to be here. And there are ways to code that in. But again, that needs to be part of the workflow coding. And then if you're consuming external resources, your workflow application might have to also authenticate to them. So another interesting thing about workflow is that, like everything else in SharePoint, it has a list of boundaries and limits. So I thought the first one was very curious, that there is a maximum of 15 workflows actively processing against the database at one time, even though a lot more can be in progress. So workflow, just like the messaging services in Q, workflow has to take turns, and it isn't really allowed to consume a huge amount of farm resources. But then again, the messages are so small that they probably, go ahead.
15 workflow is within a site or site collection, or?
No, it's the workflow has to go back, you know, underneath SharePoint, underneath the website that you see, all of the information is contained in databases. And so every time you add an item to a list or change something, then what the web front end that you see does is it goes to the database and it makes a change to a record there. And so this process, when it goes, the workflow goes and says, I'm going to check in this document that was part of a workflow task. Well, only 15 can happen simultaneously, 15 of those requests, but they might be done in a millisecond or less, you know, so it isn't really a strong restriction. I was just surprised at the number being 15, but you can have many hundreds of workflows in flight at the same time, hundreds or thousands, you know. So, and also when you're designing in SharePoint Designer, it has a 121 node XAML nodes limit. So that graphic we saw of the workflow diagram at the beginning, where they were trying to figure out what their process should be, maybe they would hit that 125 node limit, you know, just describing each action. It's really just simple XML. And there's 5 of them scooped up just by SharePoint Designer's own default nodes that start and end the workflow. So the definition file size is limited to 5 megabytes. Again, that's really generous because we're only talking text. And the workflow definitions per site are limited to 1,000. So, you know, a site collection can get really big, and that becomes the case where eventually some departments initially think the scope is this, then you start working on the problem, and somebody else says, well, what about that? And what about this supplier? And what about this timeline? And so if you're designing your workflows properly, you're going to componentize so that a chunk of workflow activity covers a chunk of the business process. And then that way, as the requirements harden and become more clear to you, you'll be able to easily add in another component or another piece to that workflow or customize it. And maybe that will be by means of custom actions. So a good workflow is actually an art. It kind of looks for the right balance between a tracking system that imposes governance, you know, on a company, and it provides enough structure to keep the project moving along and on track, but it's not so oppressive that people can't make a discretionary decision when they need to get their work done. So good workflow design starts with good business process. And so if you have ill thought out business processes, if there are organizational problems, workflow alone can't fix that. It has to align to good business processes that already exist. So then another question that I get a lot is, should I buy a third-party tool for workflow? And that's a big question because they're very, very expensive. And they're very, I won't say that they're oversold because they accomplish a lot of things, but they also don't reveal all of the caveats of using them. It's really important to remember that everything that a third-party tool does is dependent on what the SharePoint API provides. So they can't really, in general, other than through some, you know, custom programming that works around, they can't circumvent that. But they put a lot of work and effort into what they build. So sometimes we see people spend, you know, $1 billion. They buy a tool for workflow or for other things, migration, and then it doesn't get utilized. And, you know, 1 or 2 people, 1 or 2 PMs lose their job, and it moves on, and that software's on the shelf, you know, because no one adopted it, no one was familiar with using it. And for that kind of investment, if you could find a good SharePoint developer, you could get a lot of work done for that that's key to your organization. So it really depends on the scale of your organization. Like for small companies, I don't even recommend SharePoint on-premise because there's a lot of management that goes with having it. But if you get into the space where you are a larger enterprise, then big investments may make sense. And you'll have to balance what you feel is the best for your users organizationally. And so the other factor that I won't delve into here, but I think is important, is because of the constant movement between systems, you know, like 2010, 2013, out to the cloud, hybrid, you really have to look at portability. And Microsoft is very frank about the fact that workflow instances just do not migrate. You know, if you have, you can migrate the definition, but not the instance. And popular tools, like for instance, I've been working with a client on some Nintex stuff recently, and so I've been in touch with their technical evangelist. And all of the Nintex products, all the way through 2016, still put server-side code in the farm and run on a WSP. And the only one that does not is the one that they built for the cloud. So to my mind, that's not advisable, because the whole reason that 2013 moved away from Windows solution packages is they run in the main SharePoint process. And the less of that you have, the hardier your farm is. So, you know, but on the other hand, if you want people to be able to create workflow as easily as they do an Excel spreadsheet, then Nintex is wonderful. So then I guess that means that it's a major add-on to the SharePoint ecosystem. Get a lot of vendor proposals, arrange for a trial installation, and have your stakeholders be sure that they heartily approve. So this is just a couple of case studies that you might want to look at later. And there's more on the Microsoft Customer Stories portal. And it just talks about some hard numbers as to how much workflow has benefited certain companies. And I've heard this story over and over again, you know, working on-prem with customers. You know, they want to get those burdensome, repeatable tasks off of their